So it's Patrick, and you're gonna like this one. Check this out. It is Sunday, May 21st, 2023, at 2 p.m. my time, and this is Patrick Lovell riffing and truth bombing the con. And I have a lot in my head, and I'm gonna try to unpack this in a way that I think is slightly different than normal, but hopefully you'll bear with me. I think the first thing I'd like to request of you is please like and subscribe this page. That's what you have to do to get the algos up on YouTube. And I've got to reach 1,000 subscribers and likes, and then that'll help me disseminate this information to a much wider audience. So please like, share, subscribe, share, and all that comes with it. But I guess the place that I need to start, off the heels of what I think are two pretty good truth bombs, but one just got deplatformed. And interestingly enough, it got deplatformed. My colleague and I thought that it may have gotten deplatformed because I used profanity in the subject line, but that's not why. It got deplatformed because I was quoting Logan Roy is the name. Logan Roy is the name of the character. And I did this in my truth bomb yesterday. I'm going to repost it, but I got to figure kind of a way around this, considering the information. I think I got to appeal it actually, because I was actually quoting the final episode, the finale of Succession for this season, which has been a pretty mighty season with everything that it attempted to achieve, and I think it actually surpassed what the writers wanted to achieve. It was pretty brilliant, but the whole, background or the whole story, the whole framing of the television series on HBO called Succession is a fictional representation of the Murdoch family and the News Corp and Fox Media platform. And it's really about the goings on and the drama between all of the characters and everything else, but within the backdrop of what we all can see in reality and kind of an interpretation of that. And on Friday, when I got around to the season finale, which I think they aired probably a week and a half ago, but Logan Roy, the younger Roy, brother of Kendall Roy, and of course Shiv, and he was up to all sorts of shenanigans like he always is in maneuvering, and he's got his eyes on the prize, and he's trying to emulate what he thinks his dad would have done under the same circumstances, but he's finding his way, and he's pretty damn clever, but he's definitely making a Faustian bargain in pursuit of trying to maintain control with his brother based on this hostile takeover bid, based on the backstory. But he makes this assessment of the American people, and to justify why he's going to, make the executive decision to lie in a presidential election, which is exactly, of course, what we know Fox Media did, because they just paid a, $787 million settlement to make the Dominion lawsuit go away before they ended up going into court and all sorts of subpoenas and more probably dirty laundry that would have been aired. So Murdoch was just like, yeah. And as I've said before in a couple of these truth bombs, I think it's staggering what Fox Media, their revenue is in comparison to everybody else in media. Quite frankly, they're substantially bigger audience. Their revenue was 14.7 billion after, and that's profit, over and above operating revenue, which is 11 point something billion, so like $3 to $4 billion in profit, last year. And of course, that was a big lawsuit settlement, but at the same time, we're talking 1 year for $3 to $4 billion in profit, and probably average slightly lesser amount than that over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. And you can see that it's kind of a cost of doing business, which is quite frankly parallel to everything that I've been explaining to you and expressing as, we've deciphered in the financial industry, otherwise known as Wall Street. So I got deplatformed because I quoted Logan Roy saying that America is like a giant women's anatomy that likes to get copious and fornicated. did I work around the linguistics appropriately? And his assessment was, and as I laid out, unfortunately using the mild pornography, but in reference to what the writers revealed to us, was America's a laydown. That America's not going to challenge corruption. America's not going to challenge fascism. America's going to take it like what I just said. And I couldn't, believe what I was hearing, and I was, basically weirded out by it, and it was grotesquely insulting and yet profoundly on the money. And I don't want to agree with it because, of course, I'm not somebody that would ever fit into that category, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And anyway, so that's an interesting way to kind of start out this perspective. But I wanted to try to take a little bit of time to give you a sense of who I am in context to everything that I've been trying to tell you. Because somehow, some way, I've got to make a connection with tens of millions of people, and it's going to be a miracle because of technology suppression, tech suppression, and really just so much information that it's just nearly impossible to penetrate the bubble, both of the Borg, which is completely controlled by algorithms and the people that are paying for those to manipulate whatever they need to, and but then by default, just all manner of speaking about just the common human experience. We only have so much capacity, like a hard drive on a computer, to be able to understand all the things that are thrown at us. And if we're overwhelmed with information in a context, in addition to what we're overwhelmed with in our daily lives, it's very difficult to sequence the information I'm revealing to the people that need to hear it the most. And it's a near impossibility. But I keep driving forward because I've come to the conclusion that I'm the only one who could ever deliver this information. I don't know what that means. I'm not going to make any proclamations, but I'm going to tell you that I'm convinced that given everything that I've seen and learned, and more holes that are filled in on a daily basis, and conversations that I'm having with people in a whole lot of different places, it becomes clear that this journey is exactly what I'm telling you it is. And it would be somewhat of a kind of a corollary, a parallel, if you will, if I had the evidence of who murdered JFK and what it all meant, or if I had all of the evidence of what led to and executed and pulled off and what was covered up of 9/11, and whatever else. I mean, those of us who've been pretty intrigued by all of the Pentagon revelations and mainstream media's embrace of unidentified aerial phenomenon, considering a lot of stuff that I've been aware of for some time, is one of those other kind of interesting questions. And trust me, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but and I know all of the impossibility of physics and the scope of the universe and the likelihood of life visiting this Earth and everything that's involved. And there's still a lot of unanswered questions. So, if I had the sum total of all of those answers, that's pretty much what I'm telling you as it relates to what I know and how I know it. So I'm going to try to get there in as short amount of time as I can. But, one thing that I've been really tracking on the last couple of days, because I check out things that are in my algo feed as well, and I've discovered on YouTube, there's a lot of great pieces, quite frankly, and very smart people that just donate their time if they have a real burning desire to understand a specific subject. And they might not be producers, they might not be coming with a lot of resources, might not be a network sort of execution and all that comes with it, but just people that are genuinely very intelligent about specific subjects that put together YouTube videos that are maybe mini docs, if you will, but they happen to be very knowledgeable on the subjects that they're knowledgeable in. And that goes across the board for obviously just about any category you can think of. But what I'm inferring and what I'm referring to is really the nature of the CIA and what the CIA has been involved with really since its inception in 1947. I can't remember the law that it was like a security law within the NSA that created the CIA after, I can't remember the initial abbreviation for what was the intelligence gathering apparatus of the United States military during World War II, but the CIA was an outgrowth of that. And I've been really interested in kind of the chronology, the pathology, the evolution of the agency in context to who was involved and why. And these are all things that I've never had a full comprehension of. I've always had an understanding of certain things throughout my life. I've been around quite a while. I'm relatively old. I'm 54 years old, and I've seen a lot of things in my life, and I've discovered a lot of things. And what I've just been gathering in terms of some of this new information has just kind of given me a eureka of sorts that really, I guess, backfills some information that certainly makes a lot of sense to me, and I think completes the puzzle of what it is that I'm revealing to you. And that's where I want to start. And then I'm going to kind of encapsulate who I am in context to why I had to do what I had to do. And, just off the top, for those of you who might be watching this for the first time, my name is Patrick Lovell. I'm the producer of a long-form television series, an investigative series called The Con, that you can find at www.thecon.tv. It's available for a short time longer, unless a miracle happens. But it's available if you go to that website portal. You'll find it on Apple TV. You'll find it on Amazon Prime. And you'll also find it on whatever the Microsoft network is. And I think there's one other. You can just find it all on our website. But The Con is the investigation that the United States government both did and didn't do from the perspective of, we had a whole lot of investigations and settlements and so forth that followed the 2008 great financial crisis. If you want to reference them, the first one of note is the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which a lot of our work reveals and mirrors exactly what took place during that massive investigation. And then there were all of these huge settlements between the what we call too big to fail banks to the tune of $250 billion. And in the statement of facts and in these deferred prosecutions, a lot of what we reveal in The Con is also admitted by the government of the United States and the Department of Justice in these huge lawsuits and settlements. But what ultimately they do is they say, yeah, there's tons of criminality, and the criminality that we show you in The Con, but this was a civil settlement. And so what they say is that everything that we've shown you and admit to in these giant civil lawsuits, can at a later date be investigated under criminal investigations and potentially prosecuted as such. But of course that didn't happen, and everything I'm referring to happened in the era of about 2011, 2012, 2013, 14. I think ending in like 2016, the last of the settlements with Goldman Sachs and Chase. Actually, Chase might have been one of the early ones. But to put it all into perspective, it was $250 billion in fines for everything that we showed you in The Con, and then some. In fact, we showed you a lot more than they show you in The Con, but in a cohesive manner that everybody can understand, that you can't fully extrapolate if you read the thousands of pages that I've just revealed to you that are very thick with legalese and don't involve the testimony from the witnesses, that are both the victims and whistleblowers and people, the highest people at the FBI, the DOJ, the SEC, and so much more. And again, the most important after all of this is we found the only RICO conviction in the entire country for a case that was a regional case of about $60 to $80 million that had all of the same elements that everybody on Wall Street, I'm talking about the titans of Wall Street, the largest investment banks, too big to fail banks, the CEOs and everybody else were involved with and guilty of. If only our institutions, such as the FBI and the DOJ, were able to put those cases together with criminal referrals, and there's a process how that happens, working in conjunction with the regulators, such as the Office of the Thrift Supervision and Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and that's what we did. And so, my story led to basically this 10-year odyssey, this grueling odyssey, never-ending odyssey that cost us millions of dollars, $4.5 million. to put this information together. But what we found was, what was the $29 trillion truth of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history that completely turned this country inside out and upside down, that led to everything that's happened since. And so what the con reveals is what we are. And it's fallen on deaf ears, and it hasn't gotten the traction of tens of millions of viewers that really needs to be seen by. We know that there's north of 50 million people that had to survive or go through the 2008 great financial crisis. There was tens of thousands of divorces and collateral damage and homelessness and suicide and all of those horrific sort of consequences of what I call financial terrorism, and all of which basically exemplify that the law is not the law in the United States, and the law is just it's the law is for power and people who can afford the law, and everything else is bullshit. And so is separation of powers and everything else, which is why everything I'm doing in this as a muckraker journalist and a producer and an independent producer that put it all together, which is literally the most important revelation I think maybe ever. I know that sounds ridiculous considering all of the horrific things that have happened throughout history, but I really believe it's up there. And I think a lot of what I'm about to tell you is why, in addition to everything else that we've discussed in these truth bombs. But look, going back to this kind of recent amalgamation of what I've been kind of absorbing in a lot of people's work regarding the CIA. Now, the first thing I want to make you aware of is that I interviewed a world-class journalist and actually became very friendly with, and it's kind of peculiar, all things considered, and it might be a missing hole for one, but a gentleman by the name of William D. Cohen. And William D. Cohen is a kind of an established, New York Times best-selling author. I call him the James Michener of financial journalism. And there's a lot of interesting aspects of what he writes about and how he frames it and so forth. But I remember getting to him to do an interview because he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that I was just like amazed by. And it basically said, is the DOJ suppressing a witness and preventing subpoenas from revealing everything that I ultimately had to go find. And so that led me on a journey. The gentleman's name was, by the way, Dick Bowen. And Dick Bowen was the chief regulator for one of the largest financial institutions in the world in the United States, a company called Citigroup. And he was responsible for doing the underwriting and regulating internal controls, if you will, for making sure that all of the securities that they were selling to the public, being Citi, met their standards of the representation and warranties. And so what Mr. Bowen had discovered was this was all, they were selling toxic, polluted shit that was going to blow up the world. And he tried desperately to stop it. Anyway, all of that information is in the con, and I'll try to circle back that in a minute. The most important aspect of it is, I can get going in so many different threads, but the most important aspect of it is that Bowen revealed in a single case how the former Secretary of the Treasury and a former CEO of Goldman Sachs actually became the chair of Citigroup and thwarted the investigation that he revealed that all of the institutions of government prevented anybody from knowing, including media, and they walked with over $3 trillion for destroying tens of millions of people that Bowen was trying to prevent. And so there was this op-ed on the front page of the New York Times by William D. Cohen that said, was Bowen basically suppressed by the DOJ? And that's how I started down that path with both Richard Bowen and William D. Cohen, and I got the whole story, and it's in the con. And it's absolutely monumentally bigger than Watergate, okay? But when I was putting William D. Cohen in a cab after our interview in a place that we had rented out for doing interviews in Little Italy, and I'll never forget, William D. Cohen looked over his shoulder as he was getting in this cab, and he says to me, the day it all changed was the day Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. I had done my homework before I talked to William D. Cohen. This guy is the James Michener of financial journalism. What does that mean? It means that everything that he cites and he writes with the detail of the best there is. And, he doesn't make any sort of hyperbolic pronouncements. That's not his thing. He's about as professional as they get. And yeah, he's definitely as part of the Wall Street power matrix as anyone there is. He's got access to everybody. And there's some interesting questions that I have about Cohen that I'll never ask him because it's not important. Maybe, maybe not. But what he says to me when I put him in the cab, he says, okay, that's the situation with JFK. And I've known quite a bit about the JFK. In fact, I will say this as kind of as an aside. I said to Cohen beforehand, I was always inspired by Oliver Stone. And Oliver Stone was just an extension of everything in my mind and who I am and what I represent. And I fell in love with Oliver Stone films when I was coming up in the '80s, and and further down his career and everything else. And there's some interesting corollaries with that I should probably not mention. But I had mentioned to William Cohen, I said, look, man, I saw Wall Street Money Never Sleeps. And it seemed like Oliver Stone to me was trying to tell the story that you laid out in this wonderful book that William Cohen did called House of Cards. And lo and behold, it turns out that Oliver Stone was trying to get as much information as he could from William D. Cohen, but Oliver Stone's kind of this, guerrilla, and he does things his own way. And so he missed the whole point of what William D. Cohen had revealed in his work. And Wall Street Never Sleeps was really kind of a half-ass way of approaching it compared to Oliver Stone's initial work in Wall Street. Gordon Gekko and the rest of it was spot the fuck on. And this stuff many years later was just kind of a joke. He didn't understand what took place in 2008, which is really funny because my distributor has distributed Oliver Stone's most recent film on nuclear power, and he said, look, man, because my distributor knows a lot of what's going on with things I'm involved with that have a lot of gravity. And he says, I'm going to put this in front of I'm going to put this on Oliver Stone's in front of him because they're working very closely together right now. And it's crazy ironic considering how important Oliver Stone is to me in a lot of ways, and some strange things from my past. Whatever. The bottom line is it's a very small world is what I'm trying to say. And the most importantly with this whole situation, if you're tracking, is William D. Cohen said the day it all changed was the day that Kennedy was assassinated. And of course, we've all seen recently, at least many of us, that RFK Jr. has been on the stump and saying, yeah, the CIA murdered my uncle. And that's gotten a lot of play and a lot of traction. And of course, Oliver Stone has done some tremendous work on the JFK assassination. In fact, I highly recommend, and it was recommended to me, that check out Oliver Stone's most recent documentary series on the JFK assassination that was basically plugged by the system. It didn't land, on HBO or Netflix or anything else. It was, you got to go find it, and I guess you can rent it like anything else, and it's out there. But it's just like our work. It's it's not on a platform that's being seen by hundreds of millions of people or directed by the way these media companies operate, and same with the platforms that we share through free speech what we know. And if they want to attach it to the river of how to get it seen by everybody, trust me, they can manipulate it all day long. And the opposite is true as well. They could suppress anything they want. Of course, those of you paying attention, Matt Taibbi's recent revelations of the Twitter files, yeah, that reveals a big part of it. Maybe cherry-picked, weird relationship with Elon Musk, stranger things with Matt Taibbi on the post side of everything he did on the great financial crisis and his understanding of financial fraud, but then he's in a place that he wasn't before, and I think it's just because the algos give him a lot more play, which means more money, by playing the game for clickbait for MAGA. And he's talking about this guy, John Durham, and, the special counsel of the FBI that was, appointed during Bill Barr, the attorney general that Trump appointed, to basically say that there was no Russiagate. Okay, well, again, all the stuff with the Steele dossier and all of the stuff with the Clinton machine and all of that, yeah, that might be true. And then that leads to other strange kind of like, but if they're doing it and these guys are doing that, like Biden's, laptop and Burisma and all the rest of it, I mean, that's how this plays out, with the monkey business, if you will, of manipulating algorithms to take advantage of the way the game is played to get half information out there. Meanwhile, in my work, I put it on my Patrick Level Truth Bombs the Con on YouTube. If you go to live, you can pull down and check out an interview I did with David Enrich of the New York Times. He's the top editor for the business section of the New York Times, and I should be careful about that because I know that there's Deal Book and there's, Andrew Ross Sorkin, who I'm extremely disgusted by, and but David Enrich is the real deal. There's a lot of terrific editors and writers at the New York Times, William D. Cohen being one of them, right? So, and just to finish off that thought, I mean, the intersection between Trump and Putin isn't so much, validated or legitimized by this silly investigation by this guy Durham and everything that didn't reveal. But nobody's asking the question, and this ties into everything that I'm telling you. Of okay, well, what about Deutsche Bank, who of course just paid what 75 million to the victims of which I know many of you on the right are definitely tracking and have been for some time, the Epstein situation and Epstein Island and sex trafficking. Yeah, Deutsche Bank paid $75 million to the victims of Epstein. And, I haven't read the statement of facts of that one yet, but I'm assuming it's because they were probably, using his money or laundering his money and all of what came with whatever Epstein's involvement was with intelligence and everything else that seems to be a big question mark. But, the fact is that Putin had gotten a giant fine, as did Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank got the giant fine for laundering money for Putin. Well, we know that a lot of Russian oligarchs had bought Trump real estate, and there's all sorts of money in Trump towers and everything else. I mean, it's a direct correlation to Donald Trump and his business. Same with Saudi, same with international people from all over the world, but primarily, Putin. And of course, we know that Donald Trump has gotten his toes into, Moscow since the late '80s, and he was, had Trump, or he was building Trump Hotel, and he had the beauty pageants and all that other kind of stuff in Moscow. I mean, come on, it's so stupid. Yeah, Trump doesn't have any connection to Putin. Fuck off. Taibbi, what are you talking about? And to take that a step further, Taibbi was in Moscow in the 90s. I know he was, I can't remember the name of his outfit, but he was a muckraker journalist, but he was getting his toes wet and checking out all the capitalism that was happening in Moscow at the time. And he got involved because he was a young guy and he was a gonzo journalist, and he had a fixation. He was addicted to, I don't want to even go there because it's not really the point of this subject, but he had some drug problems and he was involved with some probably embarrassing situations. But I look at this thing like 20 years later and it's like the dude got leveraged, and he was extremely dangerous to Wall Street and extremely dangerous to the government because of all of his work with the giant vampire squid and everything he did with Rolling Stone with a guy who I'm very close with, his boss and his best friend, who I talk to all the time, or I have. It's been a while since I talked to him. But again, I'm in these like orbits, okay? Like I've mentioned, just if you're following, Oliver Stone, William D. Cohen, Matt Taibbi, Will Dana, which is the guy that is connected to me and Will Dana, and of course my distributor and Oliver Stone and everything else. But that's just kind of a window into just a small piece of what it is that I'm revealing to you from this perspective. So going back to the CIA and what their involvement was with the JFK assassination, and of course what's important for a lot of revelations considering the RFK stump and running for the presidency, right? So I start looking at all of these elements of the CIA, and when you understand the history of the CIA, and you understand the Dulles brothers, and you understand that the Dulles brothers came out of a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. And Sullivan and Cromwell is one of the most prestigious law firms in the history of the United States. Some of its clients included, I think it was, the large, trying to think of the name of the agricultural corporation that had huge footprint in South America, was part and parcel to what took place in the Great Depression. And then they handled, the Shah of Iran and the whole, what the company, which was like Saudi Aramco for Iran. And they were deeply involved with that, which of course World War II would be heavily involved with the CIA. Okay. And that's where the Dulles brothers came out. And then you start to understand, well, the CIA was deeply involved with all sorts of machinations during the Cold War. And this was, on its face to probably do the dirty job of, creating buffers around the world to our foreign interests, right? Which was to expand, I would imagine, after World War II and all things, American capitalism and our big companies and so on and so forth. And we had at that time the largest sort of uh, say improvement to the middle class in the history of the world, right? Returning in GIs, got jobs. We had this huge industrial capacity. People work in factories. They were able to buy real estate. Things started to evolve in a way that the consumer society certainly made a lot of sense, which, of course, when you have a balance between income, it reflects the values of real estate. You can borrow, if you have, checked off all the boxes of being a good credit risk and that sort of thing. And so after World War II, we were the unparalleled power on earth. We were the only ones really standing. And a bulwark to what was happening in Europe post collapse of Nazi Germany and the movement forward of the power of Stalin's Russia and communism. What you find when you start to peer behind the veil of what the CIA was doing was that it was an extension of American finance, American Wall Street, and our interest to basically thwart the spread of communism. And they would do so by any means necessary, and most notably, deeply involved with the underworld of crime. Because there's always been crime, right? There's always been in human nature, people do things that are illegal. But what you don't understand, and what most people don't understand, is that, yeah, the powers that be want a lot of people to go into drug addiction and fail and not become a threat to the system of their power and their control and their outcome. And so when I grew up, for example, in the 70s and the 80s, I grew up watching cartoons of Bugs Bunny. I came from an upper middle class family. My dad had an amazing job, and he was just an amazing human being. And I'll provide a little bit more detail about that momentarily. And I had a very, very, very close relationship with my grandfather, who was my ultimate hero, his Cap. And I'll tell you a little bit about him. But I got a bird's eye view into power growing up and how things work in a way that was just, part of my causality because of, I guess we'd call it nature versus nurture. Well, this would be the nature component of my existence. And ultimately, to kind of bring into more hyper focus the nature of the CIA post World War II was that they were dealing with drug trafficking to be able to get money into the hands of cells of fascists that were fighting communism to be as a bulwark for capitalist interests, okay? And ultimately, the war that took place, it was a Cold War in the United States. We didn't experience any bloodshed here. It was always kind of framed as, the standoff between these two nuclear titans and interest around the world. But both the Soviet Union and the United States were fighting a bloodbath around the world in proxy wars that were ultimately devastating to poor countries. And there was reasons for that. When you look at the confluence of the capitalist, sort of global paradigm, it's like, well, wait a second. If you can, extract wealth, through agriculture and commodities and oil and gold and all of these other things from countries that you could pay warlords to control their populations and you get everything on the cheap and you bring it home and then it's basically an extension of imperialism. So we had imperialism for 3 centuries before that with all of the powers out of Europe, and then the United States rose to become a global power primarily because of our industrial power, and then everything that situated by great decisions or good luck or a combination because of World War I and World War II, we became the world's global dominant superpower because of all of these things that added up. But it was this CIA shadow government that was using its influence and its power and its leverage around the world to do all sorts of villainous activity by way of just basically collapsing any aspect of dynamism in these poorer countries around the world to help build them out. It was an exploitative scenario, okay? And I have to point out this. I've never been a communist, and I'm not a socialist. I am literally a capitalist because I am a producer and an entrepreneur, and you got to get capital to make situations work. Otherwise, you're not going to ever make anything happen. So by happenstance, that's what I am. But ideologically, I'm all about collaboration because, I don't edit and I'm not a cinema photographer. I don't have a lot of these tremendous skills that people in my craft have to be able to make great product for people to consume, and you want to put your best foot forward, and you want to make your best product, and that all costs money. So on a personal level, I have always been that guy, and that's the background I come from, and I'll go into that in a minute. But ultimately, what this revelation of the CIA's methodology over the course of the Cold War revealed some stunning revelations to me. And the most important of which was there was this hybrid connection of power in the underworld between what might be referred to as the trifecta, which was the Jewish mob, the Italian mob, and the Irish mob. Now, a lot of people in the United States obviously associate the mafia because of great films by Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro and Al Pacino and other just great pop references to that sort of time period in culture. And same with the Irish mob, you know. Lesser known is the Jewish mob, but there was definitely a Jewish mob. In fact, as it appears, the Jewish mob was the brains of the outfit. So there was a combination of Myra Lansky and then ultimately Lucky Luciano. And Lucky Luciano, and I can't think of the other big Italian mobster down in Miami, but the CIA got secret. They had Lucky Luciano in prison in New York, but they needed him, and they ultimately, after the collapse of Italy, after we won the World War, and there was an actual, when we invaded Italy, there was an Operation Underworld, which I found fascinating because that's what this is all about, where ultimately when we got back control for the west of Italy out of the hands of Mussolini and the fascists, we ended up sending Lucky Luciano back to Sicily, and there was always this underworld of opium trade and leverage in these battles between these fascist cells and the communists, during the Cold War. And a lot of us grew up watching James Bond, and there was obviously this really polished, beautiful, kind of inspiring. I always loved James Bond, but the other side of this is, okay, well, what was the real story? The real story is that you're destroying the ability of because communism was actually a big power and a potential threat to all things capitalism in Italy post World War II because of all of the victories that the Russians had, and that's the same for everything that took place in Eastern Europe. And so the NATO powers and CIA and the Western bulwark against communism, that all was an extension too, by the way, of stuff that happened before, because we ended up, we had Prescott Bush, who was George Bush's father, was a financier. He dealt with the Nazis. If you see a movie called Amsterdam, that is just magnificent. Christian Bale and God, what is her name from Australia? Absolutely brilliant. But anyway, that's a film that's out now that just blew my mind because it illustrates how the industrial capitalists were basically playing roulette with the world because they were funding and being on board with Hitler and fascism and providing finance and other things like IBM and I think material goods from Ford and that sort of thing before we entered the war that helped the Nazi war machine. And obviously the Nazi war machine is destroying the world, to create the Third Reich, to kill everybody and turn them into slavery. So it was kind of like this Russian roulette by everyone that was fighting Hitler, and ultimately, obviously, the West and Stalin prevail, and then we have the Cold War. But it created the CIA, and the CIA had, through Lucky Luciano and other elements of this whole thing, ultimately created this underworld that has always been in existence in the United States. And so Lucky Luciano got safe haven to control the ports so they could get opium into the United States and deal with all sorts of mob scenarios. And that would lead full circle, to cut out a lot of details, to what William Cohen said to me the day that he got into the cab, that the day it all changed was the day that John F. Kennedy was murdered. And, I thought about that at the time because, here I was deeply involved with researching everything I could about every piece of the ingredient of the 2008 great financial crisis. And as I was going through that, prior to that, I had made a previous film called Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream. But I'd always had this sense that there was this dark force underneath, guiding things. Now, I just put it down as greed. I just put it down as kind of as opposed to like there's a Ming the Merciless pulling the strings of everything, that it's just a cultural thing. It's a phenomenon of everybody being able to read the tea leaves that was on display in the latest, final episode of Succession, to bring it full circle to that point. That why I got deplatformed, because I made reference to what Logan Roy said in there, and they said that I can't say anything that would provide disinformation about the 2020 election. I didn't provide any disinformation about the 2020 election. I was quoting a character in a fictional depiction that was mirroring what happened and what he said. And that's how weird technology is with this technology censorship right now. But that's not my most important part, not even remotely. So the mob, the CIA, my feeling, my sensibility, everything that I'm looking at through the lens of my entire life, to be able to understand, well, wait a second, when I'm doing the last 13 years of my life has been this voyage, this odyssey, to try to fill in the blanks of things that didn't make sense, to understand really power, which is what I know above all else. And that's why I have to tell you who I am in this whole context. Okay. So I'm nobody important, right? But I have had an interesting pathway to being in approximation of power, and I've seen how certain things work, and I've had, one degree of separation from a lot of things that hopefully will make a lot of sense in terms of the jigsaw puzzle of your mind, of this world that we live in, what I'm trying to reveal to you about the 2008 great financial crisis that fits into this huge mosaic. So when I grew up in Houston, Texas, my father was a general counsel for an operation, a natural gas outfit. Actually, he was principal counsel at that time, but he was a high-level attorney for a large natural gas firm that was doing a lot of work with super tankers all over the world, and primarily North Africa. And then they were doing liquefied natural gas between these ports in North Africa and France, and then getting them to the United States. And that's a lot of big deal of what the United States has been providing, Europe since this, Russian invasion of Putin. So my dad was involved with that. And my dad, one time, this is a very important story. I'll never forget hearing about this for the first time. But when I was a kid, I remember him getting on private jets and going to Europe and working on all of these deals with all of these governments, particularly Lloyd's of London, and they were insuring these super tankers. And he was the middleman on a lot of that. In fact, one of their super tankers ran aground near the Rock of Gibraltar in the Strait of Gibraltar. And he was the guy that they called to go put everything together and handle the insurance and everything else. And there was a time where he had to get 700 million in gold bullion notes in a briefcase from Lloyd's of London to the ship channel in France that was doing the repair work on this grounded super tanker. And my dad could have literally, taken the money and run and become one of the most rich guys on the planet if he chose to be that guy. But my dad's as honest as they get. He is a self-made guy. He went through the Corps at the Texas A&M Maritime Academy, and then he ended up, being a merchant during the Vietnam War, merchant marine, and then he ended up, working in the. I guess he got a captain a level of in the Navy, and then he was working as a captain on some of these vessels, which then got him into maritime law. And so that's why my dad was working with these ships and everything else. And but he's just an honest guy. He's a guy that you want in control of the ship, right? And he's a guy that keeps all of the compartments completely working, and that's my background. And then the other guy, my grandfather, was a guy who was an oil broker and also a magnate, quite frankly. And he was a player in Houston. But my granddad, he came from originally New York, and he and his cousins had built the largest and created the largest club in New York City at the time. It was world famous. It's called the Roxy. And my granddad, he had a law degree from Georgetown University, and then he went back to New York to become a broker before the Great Crash. And that's when he was doing all of this promotion after the fact. I mean, he was by day a broker, and by night he was like living it up with all the Roxy, the Rockettes, and all of that kind of stuff. And he was a glamour guy, like in the middle of all this stuff. Right. And then eventually, after the Great Depression, he had to relocate to Houston, Texas with his brothers to become an oil broker, because that's where the money was. Right. And he had the presence of mind to do that. And he had his own oil broker realty. And as you know, when I came into the world, I mean, he was a pretty established guy. and he knew all the players in Houston, and I used to go to lunch with him and dinner with him, and I'd see he knew everybody in the room, right? And that's kind of how it worked. So I had kind of a front row seat to power. And I'll do a quick rewind on my grandfather. Oh man, he was an inspiration. He took us on the golf course, me on the golf course, and he taught me kind of the gift of gab. And he used to always say, "You drive for show and you putt for dough." And I just love this guy. I mean, it was the most important guy in my life. He always taught me that anything is possible. You got to learn how to love to fight because everything is a challenge, and you got to overcome these things. And everything can happen in this country because we're the country of liberty and opportunity and all of those things. And so I grew up believing that the American dream was the most important thing that really was my heartbeat. It was my vector. It was everything that I am and do, and everything that I've ever done since. And so, ultimately, when you put the influence of my dad being the honest guy he is, but within context, obviously, big deals, and somebody has to be highly trusted to work in that sort of environment. But yet, again, on the front row to power, if you will, especially at that time period, because Houston is one of the most powerful cities in the world based on its fossil fuel sort of center of the world, quite frankly. And then I grew up like my buddies and I'll give you a little a side note, but my buddies and I used to ride our bikes and like think about Stranger Things. If you've seen Stranger Things, my buddies and I would get kicked off the line of former, and he wasn't president at that time, but who became president, George Bush, who lived about 2 miles from less than that, a mile from where I lived behind the guarded gates. And I always grew up in proximity to the Gilded Gates sort of thing. And I always went to school with really rich guys, and I was upper middle class. I wasn't one of the super elite, but I was definitely within eye shot of them. And I think it's incredibly ironic that I'm telling you about the CIA and of course, William Cohen and everything he told me in terms of the day the world changed was when JFK was assassinated, because of all things CIA that I'm telling you, that ultimately I was riding my bike on George Bush's lawn and getting kicked off at George Bush's lawn, who was the former director of the CIA, whose father, Prescott Bush, was doing financing with the fucking Nazis, right? So this is all kind of in my bandwidth, but I don't know it at the time, of course. But my life marches me down this path, right? So I have all of this stuff as a backstory. And so as I'm going through my education process and as I'm growing up, I'm this upper middle class guy that loves sports. I love rock and roll. I believe in the American dream. I played football. I was extremely committed to football. I could hit hard as hell for a relatively smaller guy in comparison to many guys I played against. And I was committed, man. And I loved to compete, and I wasn't afraid of anything. And I ended up playing years of rugby, and then I became an extreme sports athlete for years. And so that was kind of a cosmetic of my mindset, but also knowing power. And so ultimately that guided me to study political science. It's the only thing I could really excel at. I wasn't a great student and everything, but I understood history and political science, and I did very well at that. And I was going to go on to law school, but I decided to go to Hollywood. And as a result of being in Hollywood, I ended up working for some of the biggest heavy hitter executive producers in the business. And I got a front row seat to how that was done. And I learned about boards of directors and how, these guys maneuver. And that's why it's kind of fun for me to watch Succession, because those guys are pretty spot on in terms of how, the corporate elites operate. And I was just a small level player in that situation, but coming from my background and understanding how things work, I could see it. And so, I was always, there was a little fish in a small pond, but I got to learn how things operate. And as I got further and further into my career with that sort of education background and everything else, I ultimately went into business for myself, partly because I had to, but mostly because I wanted to. And I was successful, and everything was going the right way for a long time. And then I got blown up by the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. And when I got blown up by the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, coming from this background that I did, I was just asking questions. I was like, none of this shit makes sense, and I got to freaking figure it out. And I did. But the reason I was able to do that was because I reached out to a guy in my community, and I've said this before, but I'm going to give it a little bit more detail, who is from one of the richest families in the history of the United States. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have seen Peaky Blinders, and I don't know this for a fact, but there's a character named Alfie that was working with Thomas Shelby and everything that he represents. And I'm pretty sure that the writers knew the grandfather of the guy that I ended up doing business with. Because these guys had the largest distillery in the world. They were basically the Jewish Kennedys, and they were involved with all sorts of underworld scenarios, which leads you to all sorts of manner, shape, or form of what happens in the mob world, right? Alcohol, gambling, prostitution, drugs, all of those types of things, right? Now, I don't know how much they were involved. I'm sure they were plenty involved, but they ended up having the largest distillery in the United States. And I thought, when I went to him, that's really all I knew, right? And I said to him, look, man, your family is a expression of the American dream, and what I want to find out is what happened to the American dream. How did it get sabotaged? How did it get destroyed? How was it betrayed? And he thought it was kind of an odd idea, but he said, look, man, if you can go and figure out how we went from of, by, and for the people to of, by, and for the corporation, I'm in. And so he got behind me and we started figuring stuff out. And it was very courageous on his behalf because as I started to understand more about his family, I found out that, well, really the more interesting side was his mother's side of the family, who were scions of Wall Street. And they were actually one of the originators of Wall Street. And they worked closely with J.P. Morgan Chase and all of the guys that wound up in Jekyll Island, South Carolina, or is that Georgia? Georgia, to be able to, on that fateful Friday weekend and the week, however long it went, but to basically create the Federal Reserve. And we had to have a central bank, and we've had that battle from the very beginning of the United States, and I don't need to give you a history lesson, but what I'm telling you is that the guy who ended up providing me the opportunity to go find out everything that happened on Wall Street as a result of the 2008 great financial crisis was literally a scion of Wall Street. I'm talking create like royalty. And it's even more than that because they owned a Midtown Manhattan building and in one of the most famous buildings in New York, where in the lower floor, or on I guess the ground floor, was one of the most famous restaurants in New York. And that restaurant was where everybody on Wall Street would go to have a power lunch. And that's where deals were made. And that's where all the people that wanted to be seen were seen because that's how it works. And that's where all the whales were. Okay? We're talking about the CEOs of the largest financial institutions in the world. And then ultimately, a lot of these guys went revolving door into the Treasury and the Federal Reserve and government and that sort of thing, right? It was the power vortex. And they were all doing their deals in eyesight of the guy who ends up funding my journey and being a part of it every step of the way. And he had a front row seat to that himself, right? So here I am with my background and, with this other guy with this background, but maybe it's because we're from like 2 generations away from some of that time period, but we believed in the American dream. And more importantly, we believed in the integrity of law, which we both knew had been marginalized, but we didn't. I always knew and suspected, I suspected that my partner knew a lot more than he was letting on. His family owned a bank. There was a lot of other things that they did, but he was just such a good guy and he was supporting me every step of the way. And he really, I could tell the further we were getting into the story, the more dangerous it was becoming. And the more I think we must have been on the radar of everybody because we got the story. Because nobody could have expected that if they could control the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of mainstream media, that's all they had to do. They didn't see Patrick Lovell coming, partnering up with who my partner was. And that was like, out of left field for them. And quite frankly, a miracle. And a miracle in every capacity you could possibly imagine. And so I did the work, man. I did the work that the FBI, the DOJ, the SEC, the AGs around the country couldn't put together because of the corruption. And they all worked to a sum total of about $90 billion plus. You add in media, you're well over $100 billion. And none of them got the answers that I got in the con. And again, it was a miracle because it only cost $4.5 million to do. I mean, that's huge money, really, but it's not in context to what we did and what we've got. And again, I got the $29 trillion truth. Now, but this is the most important connection of it all, given what I just told you. Okay, so let me fill in 2 more blanks here. So the mob in the United States, and I think I said this, but I'm going to try to make it a little bit more clear. You had, the Jewish mob, the Irish mob, and the Italian mob all working together. And they all were working in concert with the CIA throughout all of Europe and South America and around the world. And, and that's part of the shadow government. That's the deep state. Okay. And And yeah, it's a little problematic when you think of like Marchese and Jews that were involved with this sort of thing that could play ball with people that were involved with fascists. You can imagine how ridiculous that is, right? Well, okay, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, whatever. You know, money makes a lot of people do a lot of strange things. Where are you in the vector? And all of this stuff plays out with Epstein. Everything that we're seeing with Epstein and everything that it touchstones on. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on Epstein, but I'll probably circle back to that in a minute. But going back to the miracle that I pulled off, and the most important thing is I told you about 20 minutes ago, maybe longer, that at the beginning of the CIA were the Dulles brothers and Sullivan and Cromwell. And so what I learned after all of this incredible work and this, I mean, I'm just telling you, man, this muckraking is so incredibly what the name says. I mean, we just dig, 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 dig. And it was glory to God finding William K. Black. William K. Black taught me how the whole thing operates. And then I went out and I got all the evidence from all the main players. And then I even went further, to be honest with you, than what Bill Black was telling us, because that's just what happens in natural investigations. And so we were able to put together all of the pieces of what created the 2008 great financial crisis, which to me, as I started looking at it really, objectively, I'm like, okay, this is a crime all the way, every step of the way. And that's what we show you in the con at www.thecon.tv. It was a massive, massive racketeering scenario. And as I've mentioned before, and what you'll discover in the con, if you see it, that we found the only RICO conviction of this kind in the entire country. It was a miracle through the gateway of us finding Addie Polk, an African-American expression of the American dream, who ultimately became its nightmare because of all of the elements we show you in our work, that had to commit suicide because she wasn't going to be thrown out of the street because she owned her house. She got raped, pillaged, and destroyed, which happened to tens of millions of people. But through her tragedy, she opened the door to reveal the only RICO conviction in the country, which proved everything that I was setting out to. In fact, my partner, Eric Vaughn, said from the very beginning, why isn't this RICO? He was absolutely right. And it took us years and millions of dollars to figure it out from all the top sources, and then we did. And then we finally get it out to the universe, and we had to, I think I've mentioned some of the trouble we had with our initial agent, top 5 agency in Hollywood, who represents Ava DuVernay, who's connected to Oprah Winfrey. And we show all the stuff that got the goods on Barack Obama, who came up from the Pritzkers, and he had all sorts of information on everything that he wrote anti-predatory lending as a junior senator in Illinois with this guy that we interviewed by the name of Ira Reingold, who lays it all out. And then later, Obama goes on to say, well, look, man, what Obama did was unethical, but it wasn't illegal, which of course the con shows is absolute bullshit. And we show you everybody who is involved, which is everybody on Wall Street, which leads to BlackRock and the entire power structure of the United States. And we got suppressed, man. We got canceled. That's all there is to it. And so my partner, who spent millions of dollars to bring you the truth at great risk to himself, because we figured that the American people would devour this, and millions of them that got crushed by the 2008 great financial crisis would want to know the truth. But as it turns out, I don't think they do, or they don't know how to find it, or some sort of combination thereof. I think we've been suppressed and oppressed by the Borg, but then everybody's so beat down that you've got no bandwidth. You can't put everything together because you're overwhelmed with information. And yet we pulled this off. It's the $29 trillion truth that's led to another $30 to $40 trillion since 2009, which is our system. And we're going through it again right now. We've got bank runs based on all sorts of versions of what we show you in the con. And ultimately, the Federal Reserve was there to regulate it. And they're doing the bailouts again, even though Biden said they're not. And now we're dealing with the debt ceiling and all of these other problems, which is just absolute insanity. And yet the machine keeps going. And to bring this full circle to the CIA reference and RFK and everything else, it's like, look, man, the entirety of the process, if you will, of the CIA in post-Cold War, particularly Italy, is they were also involved with the Vatican. And the Vatican, as it turns out, was a vector for money laundering for a lot of these things that were happening with the underworld, where money would go into the Vatican and then go through the CIA and then wind up in real estate. Which, for the course of the last, I'm going to call it the last 6 years, I've been very involved in initially just reading everything that the ICIJ was putting out, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, who were the only ones who did this. They found the Panama Papers, where they revealed in all the details the outsourcing and let's just say the extraction of wealth from countries from the most powerful people of the world, where they go into accounts in the Cayman Islands and in Central America and Panama, hence the name the Panama Papers. And they extract money, they hide money, and this is what the rich have done for a very long time. And then on top of that, the ICIJ did a phenomenal piece on what they call a huge story called the FinCEN files. And the FinCEN files are the suspicious activity reports that happen from the DOJ based on money laundering and all sorts of shape of crime that comes into the country that were never acted upon by the Department of Justice, which, by the way, are engaged with Epstein, and before with Bernie Madoff, and now Chase and Jamie Dimon. And Jamie Dimon has been revealed recently of being involved with all sorts of CIA related funding for Air America and other things with former CEO of Citigroup, when they're the ones who created all of the deregulation, Sandy Weil. They were involved with the CIA and creating these private air forces, if you will, that were involved with money laundering and running guns and all sorts of shit. And that's their background on top of, by the way, predation. So the confluence here, and what I'm trying to express to you and try to tell you based on my own life and my proximity to power, what I studied and everything I went through to get to this, to a miracle of a guy who was a scion of Wall Street, whose family may have well been Alfie in, Peaky Blinders, because, again, and I didn't finish this part of the thought. They had the largest distillery in the world. Oh, yeah, I did. The mother side of the family were the scions of Wall Street who created the Federal Reserve. And he had the courage to allow me the opportunity to tell the story that led to everything that we have, that the entirety of the system is suppressed because of what I'm telling you. And yeah, you can tell me to be careful. You can tell me to, look out over your shoulder. I'm way past that. This system has destroyed me, has taken everything that matters to me. I've sacrificed everything to get the truth to you. That's who I am, and that's what I've done, and I'm not going to quit, and I'm going to go as far as I can. But I feel like this is the last piece of the puzzle, because it might be the bottom of the ninth, bases loaded, and I got to knock one out of the park, because I've got to convince tens of millions of you that I am the only one that's got these answers. And I'm not doing it because I'm Jesus, and I'm not doing it because I want to, make myself out to be some glorious savior that, is above everyone else. No, man, I'm a muckraking journalist. The truth is what matters. That's all that ever mattered to me. I mentioned this a long time ago. When I got my bar mitzvah when I was 13 years old, that was the focus of my bar mitzvah speech, was honesty and the integrity, and that's the connection to God. And I believe that ever since, except for having all of my life turned to misery, that ultimately led to me, losing my family because I became obsessed and I wouldn't quit. And even my partner gave up on this. Everybody's given up on it. Everybody gave up on it that was involved with this, except for me and then the angels that have come and lifted me up with their commitment. Roseanne Rabiola Mile, I can't even begin to describe to you what she knows about corruption, having grown up in Chicago and being of Italian descent. I mean, everything we talk about is just so, all of this. And ultimately, Paris Dubé, who is a forensic analyst. She does all sorts of deep dive on all of the issues surrounding illegal foreclosures based on nobody has the note. She knows exactly what's going on with the courts and how they've railroaded everybody. And by the way, that's what the CIA does. In all of these countries around the world, they just have complete control. You get a warlord that controls the courts, and then you give him the money, and then you create the outcome. And your bulwark against, whatever the outcome is to challenge you. But they brought that home. I'm telling you, the 9/11 has got the CIA's fingerprints all over it with Saudi and everything else and George Bush. And that's another story, but it's the same story. And right, 3,000 people, got pulverized, and it's the most horrific, tragic thing we've ever seen in our lives in front of our face. But yeah, millions of people died in the aftermath of these never-ending wars. I think 4 million died. It cost like $6 trillion for those wars. All for what? Well, because it was probably this consortium between the fossil fuel context, fossil fuel industry, and the uh, financial industry. I mean, we've seen it all over the place. I mean, in Saudi Aramco went public in what, 2017, 18. Everybody from Wall Street are the ones who did it. Ones who did it. The dollar is based on the global reserve currency based on oil. And there's a lot of shit going on, and we're about to hit the debt ceiling and everything else. But what I'm telling you is, guys, that everything that I have revealed to you is the largest story of corruption in the history of the world. And the bottom line is, it connects all of this shit. And I know that that's not what we show you in the con, but I know that now more than I ever have before. And I'm absolutely convinced that the shadow government of the CIA is in control. I mean, especially when you look at what Obama came from and what he was trying to do and what he didn't do. Because when Obama, was elected as president of the United States based on a people's referendum, he put all the people that created the problems that blew up the world to clean it up. And that's what led to the $29 trillion being illegally backdoored to the financial industry. And you know how we know that? Well, it was none other than Roger Cohen, one of the general partners of Sullivan and Cromwell, that revealed that in the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission, and I didn't get that information until 2021. I probably left out a lot of what I wanted to say, and I've gone on for an hour and 5 minutes. Tens of millions of people have been targeted by this, destroyed by this. Our courts have racked people insane. They've thrown them in the streets. We've had suicides. This is financial terrorism. Nobody in the presidential race is going to be able to fix this. Robert F. Kennedy is talking about this stuff, but to my eyes and knowledge, he hasn't gone this far. He might. I might actually have an influence in that. We'll see. But in the vacuum of any presidential candidate talking about this, that's why I've created this tidal wave, this populist tidal wave to purge corruption. If you invest $13, if you donate $13, and that's in honor of the original 13 colonies, that all of this shit is betrayed because we're a tyranny, and that's what we fought to begin with. That's what we fought in the Civil War. That's what we fought in World War II. I'm calling on all patriots who believe in liberty and justice for all to come to the fore, and the billionaires are spending billions to grift trillions. There's only one way through this. That's with the truth that I have that nobody's going to tell, with all of the people I have access to that are a lot smarter than I am, but I've got to get them above the noise of this madness. We've got to create a convergence of tens of millions of people that are like, holy shit. The CIA is in control of this stuff and the underworld and everything else. Of course, that's why we would have the disaster that we have. That's why the rich are beyond rich, because it's not supply and demand. It's not free market capitalism. It's corporate fascism undergirded by a criminal syndicate that ironically uses socialism of the full faith and credit of the United States to guarantee this mafiocracy. That's global and now fuels fascism. Think CIA, think everything they did in the Cold War, think what they did around the world. They brought it home and it's overwhelmed us, okay? Is someone going to, put me out of my misery? They don't need to if they can keep me quiet. If somehow they can suborn this information. That's why you've got to like and subscribe. That's why you've got to share. That's why you've got to really delve into what we put in the con. That's why I would love you to sign the petition that we put to try to get my partner from pulling this from history and erasing it from history, because it's the only way this history is going to, be seen. And I don't know what else to tell you, man. There's nothing that matters in this world if you live under the tyranny, the rule of tyranny of corruption. We've got to be free. We've got to have liberty. We've got to have the dynamism to be able to be the country that we're supposed to be. That's in order to form a more perfect union. So you might think of this as a campaign, a presidential campaign, and in a way it is, but it's got to be a populist movement to where I can create this podcast. I've got to do that with funding so I can do the 501c3 or C4, so I can pay for the podcast, so I can get all of this information to the people. We'll get it building and building and building to get information that the entirety of media has failed to tell you and continues to tell you, because they want to play high school when this goddamn corruption runs ramshot and destroys us all. The calamity is insane. And we're looking right down the barrel of the climate crisis. And the guys that are in control are just pissing on all of our heads, telling us it's rain. Stop being a tool in the fool circus. Join me. My hand is out. Because if you, me, and everyone you see that isn't a Nazi, that believes and champions dignity, decency, integrity, liberty, sustainability, and we come together in unity, we will defeat the misery of tyranny, and we will usher in the renaissance of the Clean New Deal, and that is our destiny. It's paradigm change. It's in order to form a more perfect union. It's the patriots of the American Revolution and the 13 original colonies, and of course the abolitionists and the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln, a nation of, by, and for the people shall not perish from this earth, into I Have a Dream of the Reverend Martin Luther King.